Joining me today is Atima Omara, author of The Instigators: How Black Women Have Been Essential to American Democracy, and in parentheses, and what we can learn from them. The news is saturated with heartbreak, yet for many Americans, injustice is familiar and so is resistance. Political strategist Altima Omara contends that guidance and inspiration can be drawn from those who have endured and challenged the nation's darkest hour, or eras. And hours, I guess, both. Black women. She reclaims the label instigator, once used to malign them, and argues that no group has more experience defending liberty and expanding democracy. As Progressive seeks direction, she offers a roadmap grounded in her career and in the legacy of leaders past and present, whose lessons show how to build power, organize communities, and create lasting institutions. She's appeared on CNN, PBS, Fox News, BBC, MSNBC, and Joy Reid's The ReidOut. She was also named one of 100 notable Black Americans by EBONY Magazine. Welcome to the show, Altima.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine, for having me.
I added an L in there. Don't want
Oh,
to do that.
yes,
Yeah. Okay.
like the car.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Don't want to do that. I know you having a really busy week, obviously with the book, and but we're going to get started with the instigators. Okay. So the instigators, title of your book, and the
Mhm.
term you use for Black women between the ages of 18 and 45. So,
Mhm.
um, what defines this characterization for you? What about Black women's role in American history makes this term so applicable?
Yeah. So when I was thinking about, this book, and I was mostly kind of, and I laid out in the introduction, was thinking about it in regards to my work in Virginia politics and seeing the progress that Virginia made in the last few years and seeing behind the scenes more publicly, whether it be elected officials or grassroots organizers or fundraisers or strategists on campaigns who are Black women who are really at the vanguard of a lot of the work that I was seeing in Virginia. And, when you look through history, any social movement, you will find a Black woman there at the vanguard of of a movement. So whether it be workers' rights, I was thinking of one of the first sort of documented strikes for workers' rights was Black women just after the Civil War in Mississippi who were formerly enslaved and now had to make a living, emancipated, and were washerwomen. And washing
Yeah.
clothes and doing all of that. And we're like, we need better wages. We need a better way to make a living and build a life for ourselves. And, literally forming, organizing a union and writing a letter to the city council, which would have, been basically their boss
Yeah.
to get better laws passed, right? You see this in environmental justice. The mother of environmental justice movement is Hazel Johnson. And she, was a mom who worked a job and loved kids. People knew her as the neighborhood mom, organizing events in her community, and then a sudden death of her husband. Um, from an illness, it was cancer, and seeing her children get all of a sudden diseases, and they were perfectly healthy. Nobody had any genetic things in the family, and seeing it happening in her neighborhood and wondering what was going on and putting together the dots that toxic waste was being dumped or had been dumped in the area where they lived. Um, you
And I'm
know,
going to interrupt you now because using the word instigator, and these women have certainly been instigators in very positive ways.
mhm,
Why doesn't and I'm saying the average person,
yeah.
black, white, uh, black and white women,
Mhm,
they aren't familiar with these names. I mean, if sort of I was going to say the man on the street, but really the woman on the street.
yeah.
Yeah. So why
Yeah.
yeah.
Why I Most of it is history that's just not it's not taught, right? And especially I think in a time like this where a lot of history is sort of being revised or taken down intentionally. And if we don't know our history, about these courageous individuals who helped shape democracy and, expand our possibility and it subsequently built a multiracial democracy through their actions, then you don't know how to you don't have any kind of guidance, uh you know s strategy ideas on how to fight back. You also buy into a certain limited idea of what America is supposed to be, for those who don't want um a multiracial democracy. You buy into their idea of what it should be. And so I think that's why, and I think it's very much tied to, unfortunately, sort of racism and sexism that's sort of been part of our culture for a very long time.
What do you think? Racism, sexism, both? Does one, does is sexism the umbrella for all of this? The guiding umbrella?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. What I say is it's really hard as a Black woman to separate both, right?
Yeah,
And that's why I bring up the term misogynoir, which is a very specific hatred of Black people and women combined, and that manifests in the treatment of Black women. And so sexism is powerful, and sometimes there are experiences I have that I'm treated a certain way simply because I'm a woman. And then there's other times I'm getting treated the way I am simply because I'm Black. And then there's experiences where it's really like both, and the hatred is, coming at me. And those, who share my skin complexion and life experience is because I am a Black woman. And, it's hard to pick one over the other. And so that's what I argue as sort of the thesis of the book, is that this being sort of very much pushed to the margins as this part of two constituencies that are um, not respected, are, as Malcolm X said, disrespected,
yeah.
unprotected, forces us to oftentimes step up for our communities, ourselves, organize for justice and equality in ways that maybe we might not have had that not been our lives.
But you also argue, and I agree with you. I
Hmm.
think that the Democratic Party, the progressives,
Hmm.
uh, they don't have your back. I mean,
Yeah,
and I,
yeah.
and I think obvious, it was the most obvious in Kamala Harris running for the president of the United States of America.
Hmm.
I want you to talk about like these political candidates, black women, white women too, women, and the lack of um, support from they kind of force when a woman is running for black, well, say Kamala running for
Hmm.
president, they they kind of gather, they push this kind of centrist agenda, which
Hmm.
really being able, not being able to define the issues, get out there and take a stand. Yeah, I mean
Yeah, it's well, I guess there's like two things. Like one, I talk about, I guess, in two different chapters. One, just really reflecting on what happened in 24 and the treatment of Kamala Harris as vice president, and then taking over as the nominee for president. And then also just sort of the treatment of women and women of color, Black women specifically, running for public office. And um it's interesting. They love women. They especially love Black women when we are in service to the party. We are organizing, we are fundraising, we are door knocking on their behalf.
you're behind the
Um,
scenes.
behind the scenes, very
Yes.
much. And there is an importance to being, certainly behind the scenes,
Yeah.
but if we're not being conferred the leadership and trusted with the reins of power and strategy, even when we have receipts upon receipts of what we've delivered, then that is sus, that's suspect, right?
Yeah, that is suspect.
Yeah, and it's like, oh, okay, you love us for our labor, which it's that's definitely an issue. So you see that in I think a good example of that most recently is Jasmine Crockett. She was interested in being in the leadership of House Oversight, and everybody's like, you're moving too fast, even though everybody loved the visibility she brought to House Oversight with the way she questioned people brilliantly with her, legal training. She always had a good one-liner, got a lot of media attention for what the House Democrats were doing, to try and hold, folks from the Trump administration accountable and Republicans accountable in general. But then, she, doesn't get House oversight. So she's like, how can I contribute to my state? And then she tries to run for US Senate. And then sort of the same doubts come out about her ability and that she's being selfish and she's putting herself forward, when she should be thinking about, her seat in Congress, even though it's a seat that would regardless go to a Democrat because it was a more liberal seat.
Mm,
And it's just like, huh, this
yeah,
is interesting.
yeah,
You didn't say this about, for example, Pete Buttigieg, when he was just mayor of South Bend. He had a couple of failed runs statewide, or one at least in Indiana, and then he's running for president,
he's
and no one
he's a
thinks
man.
anything. Yeah,
He's a
he's a
white
man,
man. He may be a gay man, but he's a white
white
man.
man, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. So, I do think that's an issue, and when you're spending a lot of time appealing to people, as a Democratic Party, who aren't always with you on the issues and not knocking on the door of like your base and making sure your foundation is laid before you go talk to, the kind of more undecided, fickle voters, that results in the type of losses that we see. I mean, Kamala Harris didn't lose in 2024. um I mean, she lost in 2024, but she didn't lose, like, but like Trump didn't gain votes, right? Like,
yeah,
he pretty much had the same number that he had in 2020. She lost Democratic votes in all of the states that she needed to win. She closed the gap from what Biden Biden was underwater. We would have
yeah.
the data shows now definitely we would have lost at least the 4 Senate seats that we were able to keep. And she closed the gap. But you know,
But
if
there's the but and why, and
Mhm.
in conversation, I'm always talking about this.
Yeah. Mhm.
Why was Kamala talking about, and there's nothing wrong with this, joy and gratitude? And I mean, I just felt that all of the some of the rhetoric that they wanted her to talk about. And I mean, she's one tough lady with
Yeah.
lots of experience and all, the whole thing, but
Mhm.
wanted to, I don't like to say it this way, but kind of you have to be feminine. You can't be too aggressive. I mean, that all the same thing that happened with Hillary, actually. And, this is many years later, but
Mhm.
um, you, you can't get votes that way.
Well, it's interesting, I think, in what happened with her because, and there's been some research that I've read on this, the Barbara Lee Foundation, not Barbara Lee, former Congresswoman, now mayor of Oakland, but the foundation did a bunch of research on women in politics and running. And one of the interesting things that I think very much applied to Harris is that oftentimes when you are in a role where you are either like the lieutenant governor or the vice president, you're like the number two. Um, it is harder to, oftentimes separate yourself, in your bid than to run for higher office. And she was, it was specifically that role. Like, if you're trying to run for the role that, your partner was in as president or governor, and because you are in this role where you essentially have a couple of key duties where you're breaking ties, you're handling a couple of, specific things, but you're not having like this big domestic policy, agenda. And she definitely suffered from that because she had
Yeah.
107 days to pull it off. And, you know, there are people who said, "Oh no, she was free to say whatever she wanted to," and but she alluded in her book. I've certainly heard from people who were surrounding her and working on her team. They didn't want a whole lot of daylight between her and Biden, and I think she didn't get to run in the full image that she would have preferred, and that affected, I think, the final outcome. Like if you've got a campaign operation that's already not focusing on Black and brown voters, and then you have folks, you have somebody basically sounding like the person who just is no longer running for president because his numbers weren't great.
Yeah. We
That
don't want to
combines.
offend anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. That combines
Yeah.
to not quite closing the deal.
What do you think about identity politics? Because I've been listening to Bernie Sanders, for instance, and that do you think that that gets in the way sometimes? For instance, we have the first Black mayor in Albany, New York,
Mhm.
and the focus was on that she was the first Black mayor, or is.
Mhm.
And rather than, I'm not saying they didn't focus on her experience and her politics and those kinds of things, but what to me, um, what seems to happen is, let's say she doesn't do well, just related to she doesn't have the skills, or whatever happens, just because of her, how she represents herself in office, etc. It's going to come back to, well, that's because she was the first Black woman mayor of Albany.
Mhm. Yeah, I lay it out in my book. I think that identity politics gets, a bad rap as it relates to Black and brown people, women, people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus. And the reason I say that, well, one, I will say first off, I think like, Bernie Sanders and white guys, like there's an identity politics to being a white male, a white person, in the US. We don't
Yeah.
frame it that way, but there is. I think Trump taps into that very, very well. And then secondly, I do think that the type of identity politics wielded by those who have culturally or, well, culturally and racially have been in the minority in the US actually has helped expand and help this country realize its promise as a multiracial democracy. It is, Black people pushing for voting rights, that helped get voting rights for everybody in the United States, right?
Yeah.
And secure that. It is trans and non-binary, people of color, Black and Latino specifically, at Stonewall in '69 that started the path down, eventually marriage equality and the larger gay community feeling more comfortable living outside of the closet, disabled people pushing for accessibility and you know, all of these things, I think, made our country much more inclusive, allowed folks not only to just survive, but to thrive and get a little closer to accomplishing their piece of the American dream.
So how far do you think we've come?
I think we've come pretty far, and certainly from, the America that many of the women that I write about, the historical instigators, and so far that I think those who are opposed to that, who occupy, the White House and this current presidential administration, are doing everything they can to reverse that. Um, and, there's still a lot of work to do. And there's still a lot of, folks examining their own personal biases and education and all of that. But and things weren't perfect because I write about modern instigators doing a lot of work on that front to protect abortion rights as it was being eroded, voting rights as it
Yeah.
was being eroded. But we were we were headed in a better direction. We had achieved a lot, and we stood to build on that had, Harris become president.
And y- eh, I agree. I
Mhm.
definitely agree with
Yeah.
you. Um, but the focus seems to be now on, it's always on Trump.
Yeah.
It's always about what he's doing, how he's doing it. Why aren't, and it seems to me that Democrats, progressives, women, w- we're not we're not speaking up. We're not, I mean, it seems to me we're speaking up less. I mean, he's able to perpetuate all that he's doing because he's allowed to do it.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think, there is, um, there's a lot of protests. I think there's been like what, three, four No Kings protests. Each
Yeah.
one is larger than the last. That's great. I think though, and what I kind of really highlight in my book, is that, you can't just have these protests. You can't, like in Minnesota, you saw sort of the regular action of folks responding to ICE, which was great.
Yeah.
But that, the work of democracy, to keep it, let alone to build it, is a kind of a continued thing. You don't necessarily have to be the person who's lying down in front of a truck, but in a protest, but it could be, raising money for a cause. It could be donating. It could be educating, your neighbors about a policy that affects their lives. It could be being an election worker. Um, it is, serving in your local party, electing great candidates, putting forward great candidates, recruiting candidates to run for office who otherwise maybe wouldn't. And I try to lay that out in the book because I do think that, you know, how authoritarianism thrives is by making people feel like, they can't speak out. And this book, while it centers Black women, is very much about, um, you know, learning from folks who had a lot to lose by speaking up and stepping out, when basically fascism thrived in their communities. Ida B. Wells, who I read about in the book, couldn't return home because they had burned down her newspaper that she used to highlight, how lynching was weaponized against Black people. And, if she had come home, they would have killed her. They were like on the hunt for her. Fannie Lou Hamer endured beatings. These people very much knew what was at stake, and they still um, pushed forward. And with folks who have various levels of privilege, be that class privilege, race privilege, gender privilege, figuring out what your lane is because we cannot keep and maintain, um, a democracy if everybody isn't figuring out a way that they can contribute.
And that's what your book is about. It's a
Hmm.
guideline, right?
Hmm.
It's something we're not always going to be able to take the kinds of risks that a lot of these or many of these women did,
Hmm.
as you're describing them, but there are many other ways in
Hmm.
which to contribute.
Hmm.
So, um, I assume that, well, we have to read the book, obviously, but
Yeah.
and your own experience. Just talk briefly about that. I mean, because you're born in the United States.
Hmm.
Your parents were or are Ugandan
Hmm.
immigrants.
Hmm.
So obviously, I'm I'm assuming that's how you got to be where you are, and so give us some background.
Yeah, well, I definitely wasn't a person who ever thought growing up that she was going to be involved in politics and policy. I did want to do something that made an impact, and like any good daughter of immigrants, I thought, oh, I'll be a doctor, or oh, I'll be a lawyer. Took one semester of chemistry, and I was like, well, that dream of medical
It's
school is
over.
over. Yeah.
Not doing
Um,
that.
Not doing that.
Yeah.
And so I still loved writing and I still kind of hung on to doing law, but it was through some of I noticed the stories that I always wanted to write were about people who were sort of, considered on the margin. So I wrote about I went to a predominantly white Southern university, so, I wanted to write about Black student life at my university. I wanted to write and I wrote a piece about it, and I wrote a piece about my friends who were refugees, young refugees from Bosnia, and who, seemed like the rest of us, but actually had lived through, watching family members die in the Civil War, and nightly shell bombings and stuff in their communities. I wrote about, queer folk who were had grown up in evangelical churches and struggling with coming out. And I realized it was because I really cared about, what happened to these people at the end of the day. I love that my stories had impact, but I want to do more. And that really drew me into um, student government, and then that ignited my interest in policy and politics, which then, after graduation, through contacts from, going to a state university, ended up working for Mark Warner when he was governor. And that just really, once you're in that network, led to me doing more campaigns and getting involved in Young Democrats. And, I saw it as, if you're not at the table, then you're on the menu. I very much took that to heart and wanted to find a way to make impact in politics and policy, and end up working on campaigns and um, organizing, labor, working for SEIU, and really focusing on trying to get good elected folks, good
Good
people elected
people.
to
Yeah.
public office. Yeah.
And you've done that, and you are an instigator,
Mhm.
obviously. We only
Yeah.
have 30 seconds left, so I want to make sure that I could keep going on. I want to pick your brain. The Instigators is the title of the book. Black women have been essential to American democracy and what we can learn from them and what we can learn from Atima Omara also. So tell us, give us platforms, websites to go to, more
Yeah.
information about the book and also about your work.
Yeah. So you can go to the instigator'sbook.com. There you can, it's out available in stores as of yesterday, and you can order it from your online retailer like an Amazon, or go to your local Barnes& and Noble or your local indie bookseller. And you could also follow me if you're on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, LinkedIn. That's where I am the most active. I also have an account on YouTube where I actually put up some videos to expand further on some of the history of some of these instigators, and also how it ties to some of our events happening currently right now. Yeah.
Great. Well, there's no excuse for not getting in touch with you and not finding out what you're doing. Yeah, I love it. Thanks so much for being on the show today.
All
Yeah,
right. Thank
thank
you.
you. Joining me today is Sharon Vertz, author of Mask of Honor, a historical novel of the American South. Drawing on a deeply rooted family legacy, five ancestors who fought for American independence and another, a Hessian soldier who sided with the British, Sharon Vertz brings uncommon authenticity to her fiction. A member of the Daughters of the American Revolution and owner of Selma, a historic Virginia estate she carefully restored, she channels her passion for early American history into layered stories of honor, deception, and desire, all inspired by real events. Can historical fiction serve as a bridge between the past and the present? She maintains history is not just a record of events, but a conversation between generations. Sharon is recognized as one of the Washington Life magazine's philanthropic 50 in 2020 and is a 2024 Loudon History Award honoree. Welcome to the show, Sharon. Nice to have you on.
Thanks for having me this morning, Kathryn.
So let's get the question that I just mentioned or in the intro, because this is historical fiction. Can it serve as a bridge between the past and the present?
It absolutely can. And that's really what I base stories like Mask of Honor or my upcoming book, Bargains of Fate, on. Those emotional struggles between people right in the past are pretty much the same that we're still working through today, right? I mean, the constraints might be different, but the feelings that we have and we experience are very much the same. And I think that, there are lessons in those experiences from the past that we can learn from today, more from how we feel about things and how we interpret things and how we look at the future. I think that there's a lot of stuff, really good stuff there that we just need to embrace and realize that we're not the first generation to feel these struggles and to break these barriers, and we certainly won't be the last.
Because you do hear that this is the worst time. This is horrible. There's nothing we can do about it, whatever it is. And then we focus on whatever is bothering us. But it seems as a culture, we don't do that. So, I mean, I think your books are important. This book is very important in the sense that, yeah, we need to look at the past. And you talk about the emotional past, which is something that I think we overlook. And I'm saying that as we as an American culture, we overlook that. So let's talk to us about that specifically.
Yeah, we tend to focus on facts or what we think are facts. And by the way, my period really is between this, so the fragile New Republic, that 1800 to 1830 sort of take that set that next generation after the revolution. And these folks were, left with what I'm going to call, they lived in sort of the shadow of greatness. Their fathers, their grandfathers, and their mothers. Let's not forget the women in these stories, because I really, try to put forward what they dealt with. Their voices were so silent, right? And they had to bear a lot of the emotional brunt of their husbands, or fathers or brothers, issues in terms of their struggles to sort of live up to the reputation of those that were before them, and had to bear that and help them walk through that. And times were different and difficult and tough. I mean, if you take a look at the 1820s, and for example, they had economic issues. The first financial crisis happened in 1819. They had,
and whose administration was that? 1819, you said?
No, that was during the Monroe administration, but it was a result of, interestingly enough, the tariffs that were put in place, beforehand, and the arguments about tariffs and taxes, and the British flooding their markets with cheap goods, much like we see today, as we accuse the Chinese of doing. Some of these struggles were very real. They affected households, right? And so, how do you respond to that? As you just said, oh, it's so awful. How are we going to get through this? They were faced with those same struggles then, and their circumstances were certainly different, not exactly the same, but the way in which they had to respond and live and deal with it was very much the same. Without, the benefit of having a nation with 250 years of history to look back on to say, hey, we've gotten through it once, we can do it again. This was the first time for them. They were still trying to define themselves as a nation, as the United States, because before then the states were simply little European countries. You had, in New York, for example, a lot of the Dutch had settled there. In Virginia, you had the aristocracy, and Pennsylvania was the free state. A lot of the Germans and other countries had gone there. And so they were their own little enclaves and deeply, deeply divided and fiercely disagreed with each other on what things that they believed in and how the nation should be run, but yet had to come together in spite of their ambition, their individual ambition, and their division, and put to forward, what this republic was going to be and how they were going to execute and ensure that happened, that they did not fail their fathers or their mothers, because women, when men were off fighting the wars, we were home running the farms, running the households, and keeping our families together.
Yeah, we didn't get the credit I think we needed to get for doing that, right?
No, we don't.
Yeah,
No,
I don't. Maybe we still don't get the credit for it, but you talk about we were, quote, we were the United States, but we really weren't that united, is what you're saying. And it seems to me,
correct.
have we come full circle, because now there's these big and emotional divisions among the states, right?
Yeah.
So take a look at how they
Well,
did it.
well, and we learn from some of the huge mistakes. So we can look at just a little forward, right?
Yeah.
You always had northern states and southern states. That divide was pretty quickly established. Even to the War of 1812. And I hate dealing with all the facts because I really like to talk about the emotional, and how people responded to these things. But the War of 1812, the British were, flexing their muscles again and encroaching on our ports and our naval, our ships, and you know, basically conscripting our sailors to fight against the French, and they were flooding our markets full of junk, and the manufacturing companies, if you will, up in the north were really being affected by that, and the Southerners didn't really care, so they didn't really want to be dragged into another war with the British. But that happened anyway, right? So there was a big divide between the northern states wanting to go after the British again and the southern states not really wanting to do so. And then it just continued on. It was, those folks up north and those folks down south, which continued all the way through the Civil War and afterwards. So I think we've had that divide. It's been part of our culture, if you will, since we started this nation. And we still have it today. It may not be necessarily north and south, but certainly blue states, red states, we still see that division. And a lot of it has to do with what are the states' rights? What are the individual states' rights versus what is the federal government's responsibility? Same discussions. It's not really been resolved, but we've been working through it for quite some time. And I think we can learn from that, as long as we don't make the same mistakes again, that we do not go to war with one another, whether or not that's, with arms or economies or whatever mechanism that might be. We need to remember that we are indeed the greatest nation on the planet, and a lot of folks suffered greatly to establish that. I mean, think about this little colony of 13 states across the or 13 colonies, if you will, across the ocean from Britain, and we are going against the strongest navy and the mightiest military that existed at the time, and we won. Hard fought, and we need to
maybe
preserve
that's a
that.
lesson. Now we're the strongest nation across the world,
Correct.
and maybe and thinking that we can do, we have the same kind of dominance. That's just a question. I don't know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But my books, though, are set in that sort of environment, that next generation of, okay, what does this mean to us? Now what do we do? It's kind of like the old, a dog caught the pickup, you've been chasing the pickup truck forever, and what is he going to do when he catches it? So no, we've got our independence. Now what? What does that look like? How do we preserve it? What does it mean? How do we define it going forward? And there were fiercely different views on what that looked like. Jefferson versus Adams, and you had Jackson versus John Quincy Adams, or Jackson versus Henry Clay, I should say, because he was the really one that was driving the power there for the conservatives or federalists, if you will. So there's all these, different voices, but yet we were able to come together as a nation, and resolve those differences. And then, I like to focus on how do you live? How do you feel? How do you live in those times, right? What is it like to live then? And then those sharp comparisons to what we feel, our resilience of today, right? I mean, the struggles we have economically, socially, politically, how does that affect the dinner room conversations or the party that you're going, the dinner party you're attending on Saturday night? Those things existed, those kinds of events, those kinds of interactions have been, going on in America since we've been America.
How do you
And
think the impact, what do you think the impact is of the uh, information that we all have on the internet? Because that does make a huge difference in terms of our, our emotional response to all of this. Because back in the 1800s, we didn't have that as a country, right? We were more isolated.
well, by 1820, more people were reading. So that really gave birth to about 1800, gave birth to the early 18th, so the early 19th century. The literacy in America gave birth to newspapers in a huge way. And um, lies were told in pamphlets about certain politicians. And honestly, think about Jefferson. He hired a guy named James Callender to write some scandalous pieces on John Adams. I don't think John Adams spoke to him for like 12 years after that, in order to win an election. And so the information then was in print, and it came out weekly, and or by word of mouth. And instead of having Twitter wars or X wars or whatever they are now, I don't know what all the social, it's Twitter, it was Twitter, now it's X. They had newspaper wars. And then if you said something that was patently false and another gentleman called you out on it, to call one out on it would be to challenge that individual to a duel. And Hamilton, of course, fought one over the same James Callender scandal with his supposed affair with Maria Reynolds, and died with Aaron Burr. And so, those kinds of statements then had consequences. Today, we don't necessarily fight duels, but we do, we do carry honor in terms of reputation and cancel culture and those kinds of effects that happen when we misspeak. We get
Your
sued now.
books, I think, are so important because and because as I'm listening to you, obviously, but you put a face on all of this, and that's
I
what we
do.
need. Yeah, you put a face on it. We can feel it. We can visualize it. I'm visualizing the whole the duels that you're talking about, and I think that has to, so it doesn't just become, as you say, I don't want to say a boring history book, but a factual history book, okay, which can get boring. But
Exactly.
yeah, so that's important. And
I read
we
a
should,
lot of them, so I know.
yeah, right. But we need to be doing that more within the school systems too. Are we doing that? I mean, what kind of history are we talking about when we're teaching elementary school? I don't think too much.
No, I mean, I know in fourth grade, I mean, we do get, fourth grade, you typically get your state history and you do get some of it, but history books are written by the victors, right? And so we don't necessarily get the full experience. And I've been a big proponent of uh, sort of the full circle of history, right? So all sides and the interpretiveness of it, helping folks know how it felt to live in those times and the true decisions that were being made from all viewpoints. And it's tough. I don't think we get that. I think we get that in different states control the education system here. So we get different versions of that from a state's perspective. And I think as parents and as mothers in particular, I have four boys, and it's my responsibility to make sure that they get a worldview that I want them to have. I'm on a museum. I'm a chairman of a museum board here, and I make sure that I do our darndest to tell history from all sides. And we're finding more and more. The internet has been good in a lot of ways. It's been digitizing a lot of these old newspapers, a lot of these old records and diaries. And so if you just spend some time looking at some of that material that's out there on a subject that you might be interested in, it's amazing what you can learn and the perspectives that you get that are different than what you were taught in school.
Yeah,
And I don't have an answer for that, Kathryn. I wish I did, and how we could, get more of that full circle view in our schools for our young people.
well, I was talking to one of my grandchildren who's in he's in third grade, and I mean, I guess it is what you just said. I guess in fourth grade, I do remember that you studied the state you were in, right?
Yeah.
That was it. That was
Yeah.
history, right? And but in fifth grade, we had debates. We started debating whether or not, and I'm dating myself, but debating whether or not Hawaii or Alaska or both of them should be admitted it should become states. And
Right.
we had ongoing debates on that for, this is fifth graders. I don't think they do that kind of stuff now. I
I
think
don't think
that,
so
yeah.
either. I always, so my son is one of them's 40, but I've got one that's 20, so I'm dating myself. But my 27-year-old, when he was interviewing for something or another, and he was he was trying to get into private school, I think it was, and he was going through this interview, and they looked at his grades, and they said, "Well, you said your history is your favorite subject, but you have a C in it. Why is that?" And he pulls out his phone and he says, "What happened in 1492?" And the guy goes, the interviewer goes, "Christopher Columbus discovered America, right?" And he goes, "Yeah, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492, wherever that little rhyme is."
Yep.
He goes, "That's a fact." And he pulls out the phone. He says, "And I got a million facts on my phone." But we never ask the question why in school. They're not asking us in school, why was Christopher Columbus sailing the
Ocean
ocean
blue.
blue in 1492? It was because of the trade wars with the Ottoman Empire and the Silk Road. And they were looking for another way around because economically Spain was hurting. Um, and how that compares to the wars, the trade wars we might have today. That's why I don't have an A in history, is because we don't talk about that kind of stuff. We just are required to memorize facts that in and of by themselves are irrelevant to what I want to learn about history.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very, I think he was probably, 13 at the time, but a pretty insightful way of looking at what we should be teaching and how we teach history is the why behind what happened, right?
Well, how about why don't we do it? What's the emotional background for that? What keeps us from doing that? From doing
I
it?
think it's just hard. I think teachers, I'm not a teacher, so I really can't speak to them. I think they're overwhelmed sometimes. They have a lot to get through. They have to teach to these SOLs, which I don't agree with personally. I think that we should teach children to think and not memorize things to pass a test. Critical thinking, I think, is really, really important for our world. And without it, we are just reciting things that may or may not be true, influenced by, as we were just talking about, an internet that's full of, fake news, misinformation, whatever you want to call it. Now we're going to have the AI things. You're not going to be able to tell the difference between what's real and what's fake. And so we have to start teaching critical thinking skills to our young people, asking those tough questions, why, and not being afraid to change your position on something, because changing your position on something doesn't mean you're wrong. It just means you're more enlightened. And I think we get caught up in things like that we really shouldn't be. One of my characters in my books does a lot of that. He tends to, we would call him flip-flopping today, but he does change his position because he becomes more knowledgeable, and he sees things from a different point of view. Having lived in an environment where you see that. And this particular one I'm working on now, it's a sequel to Bargains of Fate, which is about to come out. But it's he's down in the Seminole in the Florida territory, and he thinks the Indians are just savages. And then when he spends time in the Seminole community and he sees how they live, the kind of people they are, he changes his viewpoint and then begins to fight for, and this is based on a true story, by the way, so I didn't make a lot of this up, but begins to fight for their cause. And I think that we need to teach our young people that it's okay to have one opinion one day and then change your mind, because listening to the other side, whatever side that might be, is critically important for us to resolve these divisions, or at least live, harmoniously while we disagree. It's okay to disagree, and don't take it personally. Don't feel offended. Don't feel like you're being attacked. Your ideas might be being attacked or being questioned or being challenged, but it doesn't necessarily reflect on you as a person.
Yeah, you're evolving actually, because as you
Exactly.
said, you're getting more information, you're evolving, you're changing. I think we get into this, we're very competitive. I think Americans are very competitive, and we just sort of fall into that competitive rhetoric, right? I have to be right, even when you're not necessarily right. So it's as you say, it's critical thinking, and it's another way of engaging in conversation. And well, the example you gave in your book, I guess, you fear things that you don't know anything about. You have these feelings about people who are different than you are, and then you become engaged in that community, and everything changes.
Exactly. And that's what my stories, Mask of Honor deals with, right? So does Bargains of Fate, the one that's coming out next, but Mask of Honor in particular is, this gentleman, this the protagonist, is set in his mind, in his ways about how things are, or how he thinks things are. And the more he experiences, the more he gets caught up into this political nightmare. And he falls in love in the process, which is always important. His viewpoints change, and he learns that he has to adapt, and and he's also being influenced by his mother, and he's being influenced by his soon-to-be, hopefully, fiance, and they live in a world. Women back then lived in a world where they had to be silent, right? But yet everything that they relied on, their financial position, their position in society, the reputation, all depended upon the reputation of their husbands or their children, their sons, depending on where you were in life. And it makes for some really interesting thinking as you read it, because when you read these stories, you begin to see that, my goodness, this happened 200 years ago, and I can see how it relates to what's happening today. Not just what I watch on TV at night or what I read on X or what I see on the internet, but or in a podcast, what I hear, but how I live, how it affects my family and what's going on at my school or in my community, or in my own household.
What do you think separates us the most? Financial differences, North and South, you're talking about, that divide, city versus country. I mean, there are probably four or five different, uh, well, emotionally, I guess. What do you think reasons why we um, see ourselves as very different from others? We're talking, from other people in the United States. I mean, all these battles that we're having, emotional battles.
I think we. It's an interesting question, and it really has to do with how undefined we still are, right? I mean, we have inherited a nation of great expectation, right? And we have to define that for ourselves, I think, going forward. And a lot of it has to do with our own personal journeys, right? I mean, um, my family my father has a different political view than I do, for example, but yet we are very much alike, and it has to do with what he inherited. I like to say that we have the situation where the generation before us has left certain things unanswered, or they've accepted certain things, and then we question them, or we have a different answer, and it has to do, I think, with a lot of our own personal emotional scars, right? If you have experienced some sort of financial situation that's you've had to live through a family that was lived with bankruptcy, and your mother worked 12 jobs and never got any help from anybody, you're going to have a different perspective than someone who grew up in a household where both parents are working, you're well off, and you went to private school. You're going to have a different worldview until you see something from a different perspective. And I think we have got to learn to embrace those differences as opposed to fighting against one another, and be okay with disagreement. And I think that that's a real key to sort of moving ourselves forward, because in the past we couldn't do that, North and South, as we talked about, and we led ourselves into a civil war, and we still live with some of the consequences of that civil war today. We still see it in some communities, and I think in our history.
Yeah.
But our problems are, how do I want to say this?
You can say
really more our own, and
Yeah.
that we project.
Yeah.
We interpret them ourselves.
Yeah. Interesting. We only have about a minute left.
Oh no,
Yeah,
it's been so fun, right?
yeah. This was a great conversation. Mask of Honor is the title of Sharon's book. Sharon Vert's Mask of Honor, a historical novel of the American South. So, and we, as you alluded to, you've written a lot of other books as well. So, where can we? What platforms can we go to get more
Sure.
information?
So you can find me on Facebook, of course, at Sharon Vert's Books. I'm also on Instagram at that same address. But my website is sharonverts.com. As you know, it's just right out there for anybody who wants to get online. But you can find me on Amazon and Barnes and Noble, and I have ebook, audiobook, wherever books are sold. You can certainly find me there. But I am pretty active on my social media, and I'm really excited to be able to launch this new series about honor, which is to me, our sort of where we are culturally today, very similar in terms of how we look at our identity and our reputation. Those same sort of things were important then, and they're important now. And it's a book that really deals with what that was like to live in those times, and then how they relate to today. So sharonverts.com, you can find me there.
Great. Thanks so much for being on the show. This was great. I really
Thank you
appreciate
so
it.
much.
Yeah, good conversation.